Hello, friends, and welcome to our webinar on how to extract data from HIFIS. I'm Jessica Brunette. I am an improvement advisor for Built for Zero Canada. Just a couple things to orient you. On the bottom of the screen, you'll notice a little block that says Q&A. It's how you can ask questions. There's also a chat function, so you can ask questions that way. And the director of Built for Zero Canada, Marie Morrison, she's on our call too. She'll be monitoring that the whole time. There's three presenters, myself, Adam Anderson from ESDC, and Ali Ryder from Acre Consulting. In between each of their presentations, we can have questions for each of the presenters, and there will also be time at the end for questions, so long as it is before 2 p.m. That is us. This is who's on the call, Adam, Ali, and me. The objective of our webinar is to understand how data can be extracted from HIFIS. So those are all the things we're talking about today. The way in which we've structured it is that Adam's going to go through some of the basic form of that, so how to get started with your data and reporting within HIFIS. Ali's going to go through a bit more of an advanced version with custom data and reporting and what that looks like. And then I'm going to talk about maintenance. So how do we get good data and reports? How do we upkeep that, and what does that look like? And then time for questions. Adam, you can take it away.
Cool, thanks Jessica. So hi everyone, my name is Adam Anderson. I work on the HIFIS Partnerships team with ESDC under the Homelessness Policy Directorate. Our team is responsible for providing support and guidance for communities as they implement HIFIS, as well as learning from communities to enhance HIFIS to make it a better product. You can go ahead to the next one. So just I'll give a quick background information of HIFIS, and then during my presentation I'll talk about sort of four main things, and then at the end talk about available supports. So this is just a high-level history of HIFIS and where it's come from and where it is now. So the system was developed back in 1999 as a response to the United Nations criticism about the lack of reliable data on homelessness in Canada. And then since then, HIFIS has evolved significantly in collaboration with communities such as yourselves. And the latest version, HIFIS 4, is a web-based application that allows multiple service providers to share the same installation and access real-time data. So this is a significant shift from HIFIS 3, which was a desktop application and created a very siloed environment. So in HIFIS 4, there is, the ability to share information much more frequently, or much more broadly, rather. And then new HIFIS 4 functionalities are currently being developed and will support coordinated access. Concretely, this means a new module in HIFIS that will be released in 2020. Also, we have the National HIFIS Working Group with representatives from CEs and HIFIS or coordinated access experts to support and prioritize ongoing enhancements to HIFIS. Next slide. So HIFIS offers several benefits to partners and clients. Mainly for clients, it means that they don't have to repeat their stories and could be considered by one or more organizations for services, so they exist in a common pool. For service providers, that means you could streamline your intake processes, collaborate with local partners, and identify local homelessness trends. And for the sector or at the national level, it can advance the understanding of homelessness in Canada and could better inform policies and program development. Next. So I'm going to come back to this graphic later, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit now just to say how HIFIS was developed. So HIFIS has three layers, and I'll mainly focus on the two large gray-black sort of boxes and then an orange line in the middle. So HIFIS has an interface layer. That's the application. So in the graphic, it would be the application box that you see. So that is what you see in HIFIS when you use HIFIS. Moving down, there's that larger sort of cylindrical box, or cylinder rather. And so that's the database layer. So that's where the data is stored. And in the case of HIFIS, HIFIS uses Microsoft SQL as its database. And so this database consists of hundreds of relational tables that all make up the data, that make up all the data that you enter into HIFIS. And then the middle layer, which would be the orange connecting arrow, is essentially the code that converts the data that you enter into HIFIS into what you see on the screen. So it translates all of these tables into something a bit more digestible, and then so that it's more easily accessible. So during my presentation, I'll focus on the top section, the application side, the default reports, while later Ali, as Jessica mentioned, Ali will focus on the customized side, so the database admin customized, less easy, as it's mentioned there in the graphic part of the reports. Next slide, please. So before I talk about how to get information out of HIFIS, I'll discuss a bit about how information goes into HIFIS and what is typically set up within a community. A word you'll hear fairly frequently from us is around governance, whether it's in terms of coordinated access governance, HIFIS governance, or in this case, data governance. So the way I like to think about it is data governance is rooted in three things. So there's people, there's process, and there's technology. So HIFIS would be the technology side. This side focuses about the people and the process side. So this slide shows that there are different players, so on the left, and different privacy and legal documents on the right. And these govern the work that the players on the left and how the personal information flows between them. So communities need to plan how clients' personal information is managed and protected. And one of the things that we say is it's recommended that a privacy officer or in some cases a lawyer oversee some of this work to ensure that it's aligned with legislation in your province, municipality, or your own organization's policies. So the first one I'll talk about is even before having access to HIFIS, employees of service providers should sign a confidentiality and user agreement that outlines their roles and responsibilities towards the client's data. So that's the third item. And so this would be a legal contract with HIFIS users agreeing on the terms and conditions for using HIFIS and the protocols for protecting associated clients' information. So this essentially would be you're only using HIFIS for what you need to use it for. The second thing I'll touch on is the client consent form. So the client consent form is an agreement between the client and the service provider that gives consent to collect information, retain information, and share information. So the consent form should provide information on the purpose for which information is being collected and used. It should also inform individuals that their personal information is subject to be shared with local service providers and that some anonymized information will be shared with the Government of Canada. At this step, the client data entered in HIFIS is saved on the server, so on the server where HIFIS is installed. So the third thing I'll mention is the community data sharing agreement. So from the server, service providers access clients' personal information to assess, prioritize, and refer clients to the appropriate services. And we say that a community data sharing agreement between HIFIS host and service providers will outline the objectives of data sharing, including a description of these data roles and responsibilities of all parties, and that protocols should be in place between these organizations. And the fourth thing is the top. So when you agree to use HIFIS, you also agree to share information with the ESDC. And so we would receive anonymized clients' personal information and use it for the purposes of research to support policy and program development. And then we'll go to the next slide. So still on the concept of configuration and working through how information goes into HIFIS, one of the key things communities will have to figure out is how it's configured. And three of the key concepts that we talk about are service providers, user rights, and clusters. So HIFIS as an HMIS, as a Homelessness Management Information System, allows you to share data or restrict data to ensure that users can access information based on their function to serve a client. And it uses role-based permission through user rights. So service providers in HIFIS are essentially where transactions are happening. User rights dictate who gets to see what information, and clusters restrict the sharing of information to a subset of organizations or a single organization. Overall, HIFIS has over 2,000 data fields, over 600 different user rights, and over 100 different lookup tables. So there's a lot of things to configure when you start working through HIFIS. There are user rights associated with reporting in HIFIS, so things like being able to display the reports, download the reports, edit the reports, and then just view the module itself. We'll go to the next slide. Still on the configuration side, there's a distinction that needs to be made between service providers and programs in HIFIS. So decisions in this area impact the administrative functions. So what level of information or what level can be mandatory fields or lookup tables that need to be defined, its usability in terms of logins, and functionalities in terms of HIFIS users' information, access rights, and data entry. So to put simply, a HIFIS service provider is where the transactions occur on a client file, so things like case management, assessment, shelter stays. I won't go into significant detail on that as we have our HIFIS Toolkit to support communities through those decisions. And a HIFIS program is typically what we'll say as like a label or a tag created so that you can group client transactions into a category. And then the grouping of transactions you'll see when you start reporting your data, being able to sort of group things in a way that you want to see them. It's important to note that programs don't have the same functionalities as service providers, and the way you configure will have an impact on reporting. So reports can be developed based on each service provider, a combination of service providers, or a specific program in HIFIS. Next slide, please. So how is data reported? So HIFIS uses Crystal Reports as its reporting tool. So Crystal Reports is one of many different types of reporting softwares. So others that you may have heard of are Tableau, Microsoft Power BI, Microsoft Power Business Intelligence, among others. Communities don't have to exclusively use HIFIS, but that's the reporting tool that HIFIS uses. I'll address that on the next slide. But one thing that HIFIS does have is standard reports that come pre-installed in HIFIS. So the latest version of HIFIS has 27 of these, and then what you're seeing there is just a screenshot. To access it, you'd click on Reports, and it would you get a drop-down of Reports Manager. And so we have 27 sort of standard reports, and that number, as I mentioned, will keep growing. And there's a new feature that we're calling the HIFIS Marketplace. So this allows us to update and add reports as they're developed so that communities and HIFIS users will not have to wait for new system releases. So in the past, this list of reports would only get updated when HIFIS got updated. But now we're able to update reports as they're developed by us, with the eventual goal to use this marketplace not just being for national reports, but a place for communities to share their custom reports. That being said, that functionality currently doesn't exist, but if you're familiar with the pit count marketplace, where communities from Ontario would have gotten their Provincial of Ontario questions, we envision it as similar to that function. The graphic on the right would just shows what you'll see when you update to version 58 or 4.0.58 of HIFIS. The round sort of circular button there on the right is where you would go to update your reports, and then you would see, the version 57.01 has that sort of circle with an exclamation point next to it. After that got updated, you'd see something below it where it's the most current version of that report. So to run reports, essentially all you would do is you would click on the Run Report button. It looks like the play button. You'd enter your report parameters, whether that be which service provider you want to get that information from, or what are the date ranges in which you want to run this information. And then you'd click Run the Report and then wait for that report to generate. There are, as I mentioned, we're continually adding to our reports. So the next report that's being developed is the Age and Gender report. So this is a report that was in 3.8 that's being developed for HIFIS 4. And one of the things that will show is the stays per month broken down by age and gender of the clients, as well as some other statistics. It is important to note that if you think there's a value in having a standard report, or if you're looking for a report that you think should exist as a standard report, let us know through the HIFIS Client Support Center, and the information will be provided a bit later. So if we move on to the next slide. So this goes back to that first slide we saw. So to describe a bit on how you would use other tools, and I don't want to step on Allie's toes because I know she'll touch that. So Crystal Reports follows right through the application phase, but essentially reads information from the database. So to develop either reports or use a different tool altogether, you would essentially go in through the database side, which, as Allie will describe a bit later, is a bit more challenging, difficult. Well, I guess as this slide says, it's less easy, and it requires a bit more access. So your service providers can't do that, but whoever is your database admin could. We'll go on to the next one. So I'll wrap up in the next few slides by just saying, we have a suite of guides to support HIFIS implementation now, so the HIFIS Toolkit. So our implementation guide provides guidance from planning to the development and maintenance of HIFIS. Our installation guide describes the technical requirements, architecture, and installation procedures. We also have the configuration guide, which explains the configuration procedures to align with community's business needs. And we have the user guide, which gives a description of each function and how to use it. The user guide is most helpful for communities if they're developing their own local customized user guides. You can sort of pick and choose of things that already exist and things that are already described in a certain way in the overall user guide. The implementation guide, the first guide, discusses some of the things I mentioned earlier around the differences between service providers and programs. And the next slide. Just to highlight also the Homelessness Learning Hub. So HIFIS information is available on the Learning Hub. It's where you will find the HIFIS Toolkit, all the resources that are available via the library, and also courses with documentation, webinars, videos, and also the main HIFIS courses are organized by getting started, how to install and configure, and how to use HIFIS and its functionalities. And the next slide, if you're not familiar with our client support desk, and if you need any support, I invite you to contact them. If you've never met them, Melanie there is on the left, Mitch is in the middle, and Yale is on the right. They're able to support you and sort of triage all of your needs to make sure that you guys get the answers you need. I'd say more specifically, I'd be interested in, and it doesn't have to be here, but hearing about any sort of needed standard reports that you think would be beneficial to you and to other communities, and any sort of additional products that you would think are useful, maybe in terms of a data dictionary, data protocols or data entry protocols, data definitions document. So if you have sort of those needs, those wants from us nationally, please reach out to you can reach out to myself or directly to the Client Support Center, support@hifis.ca, and they'll be sure to let us know. And I think that's it for me.
Awesome, thanks, Adam. Marie, you're looking at the chat and any Q&As. Are there any questions for Adam?
Hi, folks. There are not yet. We just had a good question, or an observation that we're appreciating one of the charts that you showed there, Adam, and asking if we would be, if that would be available afterwards. And I just assured folks that yes, PowerPoint, PDF, and recording will be available on the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Training and Technical Assistance website. There's a webinar page with the upcoming webinars and the archived webinars, and so yes, this presentation will definitely be there.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thanks, Marie. If there aren't any questions, we can move on to Allie's, and then if there are questions, we can always come back to them. Thanks, Adam. All right, Allie, it's all you.
Thanks, Jessica. So I'm going to be building on what Adam talked about by talking a little bit more about the, as he mentioned, less easy way to get data out. Can you move on to the next slide, please? So I wanted to start with what seems to be fairly simple, just asking the question, like, what is a report? So I find that a lot of the time when people talk about reporting, they're just looking at things like end of year needs. But I want you to sort of reframe the way that you think about what a report is. And a report is just a term that I use and we're all using to say some data that you're pulling out of HIFIS. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an end of year, something that you'll send off to the feds or the province. Can you move on to the next slide, please? So I've divided our types of reports into 3 broad categories, and this is just to kind of get you thinking about what things a report could be. So aggregated reports are the one that comes to mind for most people first. And this will have some summaries or stats usually used for end of year reporting or end of term reporting. So this might include things like, how many clients, what were the demographics, the number of services provided, but also the Built for Zero campaign asks for this sort of aggregated information every month when you're reporting how many people are chronically homeless, how many move-ins did you have. That's all aggregated. We're just trying to calculate some number based off of the data that's in HIFIS. Can you move on to the next one, please? So a second way that you can think about some of your reporting needs is a list report. This is usually used for reviewing relevant data. So you might use this to do things like show your top 10 highest service users. You might have a list of clients who are about to become inactive, a by name list, or a list of upcoming move-ins. So this is often used when you're maybe sitting down and having a meeting and saying, okay, we need to talk about these particular things, or I want to know who is worth my attention for these reasons. Again, we're just pulling data out of HIFIS, but this is, as you can see, very different from just getting like our end of period stats. Can we move on to the next one? And another way that you can think about a report is just giving you a single output of something. For example, maybe you did an assessment with a client and you just want to get a summary of that assessment, or if you wanted a summary of your case notes for a particular client. So this is another way that you could be pulling data out. Maybe you don't like the way that certain data is displayed over multiple pages. So it would be convenient to have it all as a snapshot, like a client face sheet or something like that. Another thing that you could do with this is if you wanted to share some data with someone else who may not have access to HIFIS or may not have access to that particular section in HIFIS, you could create a report that would be more shareable, I guess. So these are 3 different ways that you can think about reports. So I just want to make sure that we're not just thinking about our end of period reporting. I know it's the end of the year and everyone's thinking about those things, but reporting is a more broad concept than just getting our stats at the end of the year. Let's move on, please. Okay, thank you. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk about making your own reports, and why you would do that is generally because you have a data question that you need an answer to that you can't answer another way. If, for example, I want to know who is aging into, or not aging in, who's about to become inactive because we haven't had any contact with them in the past 45 days. There's really no easy way for you to pull that information, so you would need a report to be able to help you use the data that you already have in order to answer that question. Next. So there are, of course, advantages and disadvantages to doing this. There are significant advantages. It's faster than waiting for the feds, even with the new report marketplace, which is great. I'm sure Adam has a giant backlog of all of the reports that they're assessing, and have a limited amount of resources to create a standard report. And it may be deemed that your particular need isn't a high priority for a standard report that every community across the country is going to be using. So it would be faster for you to develop your own. You also have more control over the specifics. Like if you use a particular field in a particular way locally, then you can make sure your report would reflect that. Another thing that's great about making your own reports is you can beg, borrow, or steal from other communities. So there's lots of communities out there that have developed their own reports, and they're generally happy to share them with others. So you can you go back, please? Thanks. So you can generally, you can even think about this as a way to do some cost sharing. If you have another community nearby and you have similar needs, you can say, okay, you guys develop that one, we'll develop this one, and we can trade. Now, the cons, of course, of making your own reports is it costs local resources. And that might be time, it might be money, but it's certainly a significant investment for you to make your own reports. As Adam mentioned earlier, it is the less easy way to go ahead. Next slide, please. So there's 3 or more different methods. There's more than 3, but we can fit them into 3 broad categories. So the first method is through Crystal Reports, which is the default method, and Adam talked about that earlier. The second is to use a different third-party reporting software like Tableau or Microsoft Reporting Services or Microsoft BI. And the third one is to use SQL itself. And I'll go into more detail on the next slide. Can we move to the next one, please? Thank you. So the difference between these 3 general approaches, as Adam mentioned, HIFIS 4 is designed to integrate with Crystal Reports. So you can upload your Crystal Reports files directly through your HIFIS 4 software, and other users can run them through HIFIS. That means that your other people that you want to make sure have access to the reports, they don't need to have special software on their computer. All they have to do is be able to log into HIFIS, and then they can access the report. And you have a little bit more control over who can access which pieces of the report and so on. As Adam mentioned, the information in HIFIS 4 is stored in a database. The database can be read by other third-party reporting services, like Tableau, for example. They are not integrated with HIFIS, which means you can't take a Tableau template, for example, and upload it to HIFIS so that your end users can access it in the same way that they can with Crystal Reports. So your reporting would be a separate and apart from HIFIS. That might mean that you have hosted on your server some reports, but people would have to go, instead of logging into HIFIS to access their report, they would have to access it in some other way. And the third option that I talked about is the database it is a SQL database. That's a programming language. And you can access the data directly by using the programming language itself. So if you have a programmer with access to your database and an understanding or proficiency of the language, they can write a query without using any extra software. So they basically like directly write some code into the database, and then they can get an answer to a data question for you. Now, on the next slide, I'm going to go into more detail about the differences between these, the advantages, disadvantages. So let's talk about the technology first. So on Crystal Reports, if you wanted to design your own reports, you would need SAP Crystal Reports 2013 or later. It has an approximate cost of $500, which is a one-time fee. I say approximate because you can get bundles. It's possible that your municipality already has a license, or they have like 5 Crystal Reports licenses, and so there's one just not being used. You might be able to get it for free, but generally speaking, if you were going to go out and buy a license, it's about $500. Now, for each of your report designers, they would need a computer that has the software installed. So if you had one developer, you'd need one license. But if you wanted to have 3 different people designing reports, then you would need to purchase that license 3 times. So for the other third-party softwares like Tableau, for example, the cost is going to be variable depending on the software itself. So Tableau Desktop, for example, costs $60 a month and up, so that's $720 a year. I say and up because that's the cheapest version, and of course it's subscription-based. But you, again, may already have a license for some reason, so the cost may not matter to you. There's other software. I mentioned Microsoft Reporting Services because you can get that for free. And there are other ones as well that have a variable cost. So there's a cost to acquire the software. The third category, which is the SQL, basically all you need is the software that's already being used to host the database. It's called Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, which you can use to type some code in and pull some data out. Because you already have it installed to run HIFIS, then it's free. And so it's the lowest cost option for you. Now, for all 3 of these versions, your report designers are going to need a computer with access to the database, which is not insignificant. That usually means that your IT department would have to help them configure firewalls and stuff to make sure that they are able to read data from the database. And they also need the software installed on their computer. So as I mentioned before, if you have one report writer, then that means you'd need 1 copy of the software. But if you had 2 or 3 or 4, you might need more copies. But then for report readers, that's the people who aren't designing the reports, the people who just want to see the end result and fill it with their data. So on the left-hand side, Crystal Reports, all people need is a computer with access to HIFIS 4. So anyone who can log into HIFIS. In the middle one, they'll need the ability to access the report output, which varies depending on the software. So for example, Tableau, you might host it on an online portal and then anyone could access it. For some other software like Microsoft Reporting Services, you might have to also have the software installed on your computer, or you might have to specifically host the report on a server or do something else. So again, this category has a lot of variability, but you would need some separate way for people to be able to access the output. Then the third one, which is SQL, basically this is not intended for public consumption. So in order to actually look at the output, you would need to essentially be the report designer. Type some code in, it'll give you some results, but it's all on that same computer. Let's move into the next slide, please.
Ali, a quick question before we move on to that one. Someone was wondering if the 2013 version of Crystal is new. They're using 2011.
I am not sure off the top of my head. I know you can't use 2008. I can't remember if 2011 or 2013 is the minimum cutoff. Maybe Adam will be able to get us an answer. Or I can provide an answer later.
Yeah, I'm just looking up our minimum requirements. So we'll move on. I'll find it in the meantime.
Thanks. Okay, so now moving on to the human resources and training side of things. So generally speaking, Crystal Reports, Tableau, or other software, you can generally sign up to do about a 2-day intensive course. So 2 full days back to back. I don't have costs listed for this because it can be quite variable. So for example, you could send someone to Toronto to do a 2-day course where they're in a room with 50 other people, and the cost might be a little lower, but then you have to pay for, you know, accommodations. You could hire a trainer to come to you directly. So just imagine whatever the cost might be, it's 2 full days of training approximately. You might be able to do it in 1 day or 3 days, but that seems about the standard. Unfortunately for SQL, there's generally no training available. And I know this the hard way because I actually looked to try to get training on SQL recently, and basically there's no courses. I tried contacting the 3 post-secondary institutions in my community, and none of them offer courses on it that an outsider can take. Usually if people have knowledge on SQL, it's either self-taught, like they bought a textbook or did some tutorials online, or maybe they have a degree in like computer programming from university or college. So that's where you'd get that training. So then in addition to the training itself, you will of course need some time to become more proficient. So if you think about a software like Excel, for example, you might know how to use it basically and know generally that you can put formulas in cells that reference other cells and will calculate things for you. But it might take you a while before you're comfortable with that and remember what all the formulas do. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about proficiency. The time between when you generally know what you're doing or have an idea of where to start and you're actually comfortable with the software and can respond to requests efficiently, I guess. So for Crystal Reports or Tableau or similar, it'll probably take a few weeks to a few months, depending on how much time you're dedicating to it. Like if you're doing it off the side of your desk, it's going to take you longer to get comfortable. But if it's sort of a full-time thing, then you probably could master it in a couple weeks if you had the dedication and the training available. For SQL proficiency, as I mentioned, because there's a lack of training, it might take you months, it might take you years. You're learning a new language, a programming language. And then for any of these 3 approaches, you're going to additionally need familiarity with the HIFIS 4 data structure. So unfortunately, a lot of the time, if you take training on Crystal Reports or Tableau, then they use a sample database that you can use and practice with, but it'll be something like sales figures. So it'll ask you, how many sales did we make last month, or who's the top performing salesperson, and then you leave the training and you say, okay, but where is the data stored in HIFIS? So familiarity with the HIFIS 4 database, where to find the data you're looking for, that is something that can take months for you to become accustomed with. All right, let's go on to the next slide, please. So here is a just quick overview of the 3 different approaches. So Crystal Reports generally recommended. It's the most supported, the most integrated. Lots of communities are using Crystal Reports, so there's like a cross-pollination, I guess. You can ask other communities what they're doing and for tips and all that good stuff. The biggest con for Crystal Reports is it's not free. Although, again, you might be able to get a free license if your community has already purchased one. But also it's not free in as much as you would need to train some staff to become proficient with it. The other con is it's not as shiny as Tableau. It's functional, but people often say, Tableau is much prettier. So let's move on to the second category. Tableau obviously has the pro of being the shiniest, the prettiest. There's a pro for using any of the third-party softwares is you may already be proficient with the software. So I know of one community that's using Microsoft Reporting Services almost exclusively because their entire IT department was already trained on it and proficient with it. So it was the most efficient way for them to design reports because they already knew how the software worked. The cons for using any of these other third-party reporting softwares are they don't integrate with HIFIS and they could be costly. Again, that's a maybe. It depends on the software you're using. Now for SQL, the pro obviously is it's free. If you're proficient with the software, it's actually the most efficient. Adam was talking before about layers of the software, and I don't want to go into too much complicated jargon, but basically SQL is you are sort of making a shortcut straight to the data, where Crystal Reports and Tableau and the other things present an interface. The report will ultimately translate whatever you want to do into a SQL query, and then generate an output. So if you know SQL itself, you can create the query without going through all those layers, and it'll result in a report that actually is faster, will pull the data more efficiently, use less processing power. But that's a big if you're already proficient. The con, of course, is it's the most difficult to learn, and the reports are really only usable by admins. So whoever your programmer is, you can ask them for data. They can maybe save it as an Excel document and email it to you, but an average user wouldn't be able to access the report otherwise.
Ellie, there's a couple of questions here.
Okay.
One is, how would you recommend gaining a deeper understanding of the data structure in HIFIS? Like if you did want to do that, like, I don't know, you have thoughts?
So as far as I know, I'm the only person that provides those answers. I do offer a 2-day Crystal Reports training. Not that this is a sales pitch, but I do offer a 2-day Crystal Reports training that will talk about the HIFIS 4 data structure. But besides that, there is a website that the developers have posted. It's I would like to, hang on, I'm going to put this in chat. It's support.hifis.ca/tables.html. Oops, I sent that the wrong way. All right, anyways. Sorry, guys. What that website is an overview. It's called a database schema. And it has an overview of all of the tables and fields that are in HIFIS, and it shows how they link to each other. However, it is really not very user-friendly. So if you're just like at the very beginning of your journey and you're like, oh, I'll read this and it'll answer all my questions, it will not answer all your questions. It might make you more confused. So you can figure things out through trial and error, I guess, or look at some existing reports. If you have, say, Crystal Reports installed on your computer, you can open it up and see how it's pulling data, like what tables it references. But unfortunately, there's really no great answer. I'm not aware of any resources that the ESDC has provided. Adam?
No, that's sort of acknowledged on our end as a gap that we need to address.
Okay, Marie?
The other one, and just to reference for folks to check in the chat, because people are posting some links to things that may be of interest to the group as Allie's talking, and Allie posted her link in there. So that's it.
Cool. All right, let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so hypothetically, let's say you are moving forward with the report design process. You want a custom report made. How would you go about doing that? So let's move on to the next slide, please. Step one, regardless of any of the approaches that you wanted to use before, is you're going to want to be clear about what you want your report to do. So if you can't articulate what you want the report to be able to do, you won't be able to know if it's giving you the data that you need. So for example, I've had people tell me sort of vague report requests before, like they might want to know how many of their clients are Indigenous, and then didn't really have an understanding of what was the definition of our clients. Do we want all of the clients in the database, or just the people that they'd seen in the past week, or only people that were staying in the shelters? So you'll need to be more specific about what exactly you want to be capturing. So essentially any data points that you want to include on the report, you should have a pretty good idea of what specifically you want that number to look like. It's helpful to write a report specifications document or design a mock-up of the report, just so that you can, like with fake data in it, or just some numbers or placeholders, just so that you can have an idea of how you think the report should function. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a report specifications document that I received from one of my clients. I hope they don't mind me using it. It doesn't say anything incriminating on it. I think it's a great example because it talks about the purpose of the report, the formatting, what parameters they want, what fields to include, where those fields can be found. So essentially, there's really no confusion if there's a date printed on the report and people say, well, where does that date field come from? You can return to a document like this and say, oh, it's coming from that specific field here. Next slide, please. So the next thing that you might need to do is define some terms. So sometimes report specifications might sound straightforward, but they could require specific definitions. You might want to have a report that looks at your episodically homeless clients, but that of course requires a further definition of what constitutes an episode of homelessness. So if someone stays in shelter for 3 days, then leaves for 3 days, and then comes back, is that one episode or two? You'll need some definitions for some of the terms that you might want to include in your reports. I had a report request recently that asks for the average length of stay for households, which of course needs to be unpacked quite a bit. So first of all, are we talking about the difference between a book in and a book out? That would be the default assumption for a length of stay. But what about shelters that are in the practice of booking out every client every morning, regardless of whether they're coming back the following night? And also, this is the average length of stay for a household. So what happens when some people in a household book out earlier than others? As an example, let's say you had a family of 4, they're staying in a family shelter, maybe dad goes to jail for a few nights, so he books out early, then the kids go and stay with the grandparents for a few nights, and then they come back. And so what is the length of stay for the household as a whole when every individual client has a different length of stay? So I don't have any answers for those questions. The point is, if you want to report and you're trying to answer a question, you'll need to be more specific about how you would, like, what does that mean? What are you trying to get at? Next slide, please. All right, so after you design your report specifications and you make sure you're clear on the definitions, the next step, you would identify your report developer. So that could be someone who's in-house that's in charge of making reports for you. It could be hiring a consultant, but you'd provide them with that information. They would then translate that into a report template. So that's the magic happens. And then you have a shiny new report. So that's the end result. You have a report you can upload to HIFIS or run on your Tableau server or whatever the case may be. Next slide, please. All right, so that was all about making your own reports. And of course, another advantage of using reports in HIFIS 4 is that you can borrow reports from another community. So let's move on. So if you wanted to borrow reports, which I highly recommend, because I'm pretty sure most of your reporting needs are going to be, most of them are going to be similar to other communities' reporting needs. You can borrow a report. It's easiest to borrow using Crystal reports. As I mentioned, it's the most supported. So each Crystal report, the template of the report itself is a .rpt file, like a .doc or .xls. It's a .rpt file. You can then upload that report, upload that file to HIFIS as a custom report, and then people can run it. It does not actually require the recipients to have Crystal Report software installed at all. Now, I just wanted to make sure we're clear here. A .rpt file is the report template, it says, I want to pull the following data from the following places, and it is not filled with data. You might have a .pdf that is a report output that says, you know, here are my stats for the month of February. Next slide, please. All right, so just so you guys have an idea of how you'd get those reports. This is a slightly older screenshot than the one that Adam shared, but for next to each report, the very last icon on the right-hand side with an arrow going down is, it says download this report template. So that would download the .rpt file, and then you could send that to, like, email it to a colleague. You could open it on your own computer using Crystal Reports and modify it, or anything like that. Now, when you have a .rpt file, you'll see at the top of the screen, there's an Add Report tab, and you can go there and just upload the file, give it a name, and it's quite easy to share reports. Next slide. Okay, so I think this is the last slide that I have. Borrowing Crystal Reports templates generally works out of the box. I'm gonna say about 75% of the time, so not always. It is less likely to work if either party involved has more customization. So I'm using some specific examples here. Chatham-Kent has a cool program called the Homeless Response Line, but they're storing data in it in a way that's fairly unique from other communities that don't have a homeless response line. So any of their reports that might reference that are not going to do anything for another community. Waterloo has a cool housing plan that they're using to help their clients, you know, come up with a plan to obtain housing, and that's stored as a custom table. Some of their reports reference the client's housing plan, and it's a custom table, so if you don't have the same custom table on your community, on your HIFIS, then the reports wouldn't work. London is doing something similar with some outreach, some custom tables related to street outreach. So if you were to borrow an outreach report from London, it probably wouldn't work for you. So these are just cases where there's more customization than is typical. If you have some community that just has a report that says how many people stayed last month and what were their demographics, then that should be able to work regardless of who made it, where it comes from. A disadvantage to borrowing reports is you may not be sure exactly what the data is being reported on. So it might give you a total at the bottom of the screen, and you're not sure if that's unduplicated clients or duplicated clients or the number of services or the number of households. That's one of the reasons why a report specifications document is really helpful to have. So you could share that as well. And hopefully good reports will be clear, but you, if you didn't design the report yourself, then you may have assumptions about how a field is being calculated that may not in the end be accurate. Now, just a final note about borrowing reports. You can take the report file and upload it to HIFIS directly, and it should work. But if you wanted to make any changes, like this report is 90% good, but I want to include this extra field, then if you wanted to make an edit to the report, then you would need to have Crystal Reports installed on your computer. So you would need to open it in Crystal Reports, make the changes, save a new version, and then upload it. So just to be aware of that, it is an option. It's very useful to do. Saves you a bunch of work because someone else has made a lot of it, but you would need Crystal Reports if you wanted to make any changes to it. Can you go to the next slide? I think it's just contact info. Yep. All right, so that's the end of my piece of the presentation. If you had additional questions, here's just some contact information. And I'm gonna turn the floor back over to Jessica or Marie for questions.
Thanks. Does anyone have any questions for Ali in the chat or the Q&A box?
Not seen any further questions coming in. I will just say that Adam answered back and said Crystal Reports, anything after 2008 will work.
Okay.
And that's it. Yep.
Awesome. So because there's about 5 minutes left, what I'll do is I'll give a really quick overview of what you can expect in the next section of slides, and then you're free to go and look at them after once we release the PowerPoint online. So
Sorry, I talked too long.
Oh no, you're perfect. I thought you did such a great job of letting everyone know. So this one So it's just data, good data and reports. So it lets you know what good data is. It lets you know what we collect from data. But what I would really like to speak to, just so you get an idea of what's going on in these slides, is this particular diagram. So you'll see the circle with 3 little ones attached and then one in the middle. So what this really is this is how we get good data. It's a constant loop of training, practice, and review with communication at the heart of it. And by that I mean when we train people, when people are actually inputting data and we review it, this feedback loop never stops. So we'll always be working as HIFIS updates, as our community grows, as partners keep joining in. How we get good data is always referring back to here. What you can see from the slides are just an overview based on which section of the diagram, and communication will always be on every single one of the slides. So it'll show that continuous feedback loop when you go through them. It also ends with what I think is a super cool example from Peterborough. It's a diagram of their housing history. What I would like to point out about this diagram, just to give a bit of context, is that their lovely HIFIS lead, Aaron Forrest, created this diagram to help their data, to help staff who are inputting data and their team for decision making see what was going on with their housing history. So in this particular diagram, all of the white dates are blank. They don't have any housing history information in them. All of the blue squares have shelter data. So with this particular client, they're known to be experiencing chronic homelessness, except their data doesn't show it. So this particular visual was used to communicate to everyone on their team the importance of data entry and how it can affect someone. And it was done in such a really nice way as a tool of communication so that you can really understand the impact of data. And it also really grounds that discussion so that you're not just talking about something in theory or just as an abstract. Here you can actually see what the impact is. So I would encourage you that whenever you are talking about data or you're training, visuals are always so great to really take that from a conversation that's up in the air to grounding it into something you can see and something to really help you understand. That being said, does anyone have any questions for us?
Hey, Jessica, I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Magical. So then I will end our webinar. Thanks so much for joining. There will be a recording of this as well as the slides on the TTA portion of the CAH website. Thanks, friends. Oh, unless there is a chat.
Nope, just thank yous.
Oh, perfect. All right. Well, thanks everyone. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Bye now.